And kaboom. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Welcome down the Security Rabbit Hole, friends, to yet another edition of the Down the Security Rabbit Hole podcast. This is I, the White Rabbit, Rafflos, saying hello. I'm back from vacation and properly refreshed. I suspect that's where James is, vacationing. And in the meantime, I thought I would do a reciprocal a comeback episode with my buddy Dan. If you haven't checked yet, Dan tagged me on this thing. His title on the episode I did on his podcast was Grumpy Experts Shed Light on Repeating AppSec Challenges. I resemble that remark. So go check out danondev.com and his latest episode because it has your favorite podcaster on it. That would be maybe me. But all right, I'm going to let him introduce himself, talk a little bit about his show. He can give a better background of himself than I can. Dan, over to you.
Yeah, thanks. So Dan Kirkendall here, and I recently started danondev.com. I had a podcast. My original podcast was Man versus Web App. Actually, I think it was Mighty Seek podcast, but I did Man versus Web App for a good minute, and did some podcasting with the Security Place podcast. I've been in the space for quite a while. Actually, with podcasting quite a bit, and actually, I did, some of you guys may not realize, but when podcasting first came out, and Apple first added podcasting to iTunes, I helped the iTunes team put our podcast directory from Podcast Alley into their database, and was the seed of their original podcast directory. And
Dan, are you about to do a back in my day segment here?
Yeah, back in my day. So then they also added a bunch of stupid RSS tags that nobody knew how to implement. So I actually created a plugin called PodPress for the WordPress community to actually be able to configure their podcast into iTunes. So I think most people, if they're using WordPress, they're familiar with PowerPress. That's actually a fork of my old code. So, but anyway, That was on the podcasting. And security, I've been in security since the late 90s. Primarily on the testing side, on the DAS side, with a company I started called NT Objectives. Ran that until 2015 when I sold to the Rapid7, and then stayed there for about 8 years building the application security branch of the company. And that's what I've been doing for up until recently. Now I'm playing around with some new startup ideas.
Oh man, listen, our conversation on AppSec went about as you'd expect, right? Back in my day, get off my lawn, Caleb. We see you. I don't know about Bob Agro over there, but see you as well, man. It's been a heck of a minute. Maybe I'll get together at Black Hat this year and do a good old get off my lawn session. But look, it's been a while since we all kind of got into this field, and arguably I've taken a divergent path from you guys, but it's funny. What we sort of said was the more things change, the more things stay the same. We are on that hamster wheel. It's just that the time it takes to go around seems to be getting shorter. And it's interesting because we've all been a part of the AppSec community for a bit, Dan. For a minute, back when it was, I remember back when OWASP was founded, and the top 10 was a brand new thing, and now it's the same brand new thing with slight changes. Now with more AI, but to be fair, things do change quite a bit as languages evolve. Entirely new programming languages come up. So give me your thoughts on. I guess we'll just continue the conversation from the other podcast. And if you're a listener, and you're like, what in the hell are they doing talking about? Then go listen to the other one first and then come to this one. But I think where we're kind of taking this conversation is where as languages evolve, they become inherently more safe to use, right? As we get better abstraction, and we also get uh, easier to write code, which is both a great thing and a bad thing. What are your thoughts on? Let's start there. What are your thoughts on these like low code, no code things where you just drag and drop ideas and everything just magically works together?
Yeah, I mean, some of that still freaks me out, right? I mean, I'm a little old school in that, and I think you had mentioned when you were on my show that you don't like doing a lot of dev, right? Or you want people
Dude,
to
I'm the
stay
worst
away from.
developer in the history of mankind. I have a good sense that there are squirrels that can type code better than I can, but
Yeah, so I've actually done a lot of dev, and I enjoy doing dev whenever I can, and that was even through my evolution of Rapid 7, trying to get back into writing more and more code. Um, so these no code kind of freak me out a little bit because it's weird that they take away so much of the work. But and I think you had mentioned it as well, that like standards actually can make a big difference. And so what a lot of those no code solutions or even low code solutions do is set a lot of standards for you, right? A lot of stuff is handled in the framework. So you're just picking up and doing your actual bit of functionality, but a lot of the framework is handling everything else. The framework could be handling a lot of the input validation, setting up whatever. It handles so much of it, but it makes the framework that much more critical. If the framework sucks, everybody's code is going to suck, right? And so that framework
yeah.
becomes super critical to have a lot of eyes on it and have it done well.
Well, so um that's what freaks me out. And again, I'm like him. I think I'm just old school, maybe just grumpy. I don't know. But when you look at the way that software is developed, when you look at the way code's written, in the more you abstract, the less you actually know about how or why something happens. And it, out of sight, out of mind, right? So examples in this are like with includes, for example. When we had that, was it struts that had the major one dot something that had the major like world ending bug, and people were like, I don't use struts. You scan your code, you're like, oh my god, it's in every piece of code I've ever written. um, when stuff like that happens, it forces us to look at the building blocks of how we built what we've built, because we always, I mean, when you're writing something and it's easy to throw together a couple lines because the framework does all this magic on the back end, things just happen, classes are imported, if you're a C developer, I guess, from old school days. You know, all kinds of includes happen. The libraries are included. This, and suddenly, like, hey, I just put this input in here. All this magic happens. My code processes it and ships this thing out. And then you got a vulnerability in one of those intermediate layers. Okay, and one, because we've had the S-bomb conversation probably more times, and I'll probably have it again, and I'll probably ask you before the end of the show about this, but because nobody really keeps a good bill of materials of how things are built, much less within the frameworks themselves of how they function. So when there's an issue, doesn't that make things harder if we're not paying attention? And that's the caveat.
Oh,
If we're not paying attention.
even if you are paying attention, have you ever run npm install of a package, right? Or you do npm install of your requirements file that has like,
Scroll.
yeah, if you put three things in there, and then those three things each include three things, which includes three things, which include three things, right? Like the even if you're trying to pay attention, you don't know. And then you may do it once, let's say you inventory it, and then there's an update that the developer of one of those packages could include a whole new chain of packages, right? So
Yeah.
that stuff, I was doing some Chrome extensions work and building some stuff, building like a Chrome extension so I could test some code and test some functionality, and kind of got into that world of actually like hands-on using it. And man, it was shocking. And this is the thing, and going to the no code, that does worry me because there are less and less people capable of understanding what those frameworks are doing, right? You've got a whole sea of people who are building on top of those frameworks, but very few people that actually know how the project's working. I got into security and into development because again, back in the day, right? Back in the day, I uh, tried helping some developers. And the way I actually got in is I found very early, like this is like 94, 95. Maybe it was 96, I think, when Linux really started kind of coming out a lot more. And I saw developers hated writing documentation. And I needed to learn how to like install stuff. And so I basically started making deals with developers that like, I'll write your docs if you'll tell me how this stupid thing works, right? And started realizing like these developer smucks just like me, they're just cobbling together the code. And so like at some of the first open source conferences, like the O'Reilly open source conferences, if you go back then, I was meeting a lot of these developers because I was doing my own open source work at that point. And they were all just other schmucks writing code, trying to make things work. But those pieces that they were building became the building blocks. And they weren't like super devs. They just happened to build frameworks, right? I ran this project called PHP Groupware for quite a few years and had a lot of contributors. At one point, we had like 35 developers working on it actively. So it was a pretty big project. And oh my gosh, the messes we created. And so when I look at these projects, right, when I look at Node, I'm like, oh, wow, there's a lot of people contributing to this at many levels of development skill and experience, just tossing stuff in there that nobody knows about. It's just a matter of time, right, before like a struts like thing comes up.
I'm surprised that more of them don't come. More catastrophes like that don't come up more often. I'm all for the more eyes on this, make this better, as long as those eyes are all qualified, right? Because then we get into the infinite monkeys at typewriters problem, and it doesn't write the world's greatest novels. So when you've got something like a framework that's like you're talking about, it's being contributed to actively by people of various skill levels, at some point, like that's awesome, right? Contribution is awesome. The mix of ideas, things that one person or a small group would never think of, which is fantastic. That's what we want. That's how you get innovation. However, at some point, a group or someone has to sit down and go, all right, what in the heck do we have here? Right? What of this, how much of this makes sense? How much of this, like, what exactly is that function? And I'm not even talking about yes, we could have purposely hidden malicious functions, things that get included. And we've heard whispers of that for a while now. But I'm actually more concerned about the accidental oopses that make it in that that nobody notices or that looks good. Because I'll tell you what, I just had this perfectly relevant experience. I wrote a piece of content for my day job. There's something we're working on. Had 4 levels of people proofread it. Went to the designer. The designer gave me a proof, and I'm looking at the proof and going, "What the hell does that sentence say? Like, was I sleep deprived when I wrote that? Like, what? Like, wait a minute. 5 or 6 people have read this. They all think this sentence makes sense. Like, this sentence is nonsense." And I'm thinking to myself, boy, I how do we fix this, right? How do you fix that? Because we're not perfect, right? I tend to read something and if it's going well, I'll skip a sentence or I'll just kind of like, my brain will fix the broken sentence. I imagine it works the same way if you're reading source. You're like, oh, and your brain sort of goes, oh, that's what they intended was, nah. And meanwhile, the mistake is there. And you get these fairly complex issues. Let me ask you something, because as I was saying that, just popped in my head. As you get abstracted, because this is out of my realm of expertise, as you get abstracted languages, do the oopses get bigger or and more significant because they're abstracted so much that nobody really understands? Like, the people that are using that language don't necessarily understand the push and pop of the stack at that very low level?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think they do because, especially, I mean, any developer knows, like, as you're building your code and your object oriented code is organized, you've got your call stack could be like, goes way, 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 way down, right? And so as you're looking at a piece of code, you're looking at this section, and this section is going to call into this other section, and then when you're reading, you just have to assume the other section is doing its job, right? And you don't know all the time exactly what those other calls are going to accomplish, other than like, oh, that's going to take this data and come back with, I don't know, it's going to parse it, whatever. And then now you got an object. So you're just going to kind of read through that. You're not going to dive into the library, because otherwise you're going to go like into an endless loop, right, of trying to look at each layer. But what you'll find is that a lot of times developers will see that, oh, this is, I don't know, it parses, let's just imagine it parses a comma delimited list, right? Something silly, right? Cool. So you got the file and you got to put it over there. Somebody in that parsing code at some point may say, oh, you know what? I have an edge case issue I want to be able to do, right? I have this, found this time where, there was 2 commas. I don't want to have 2 columns. I want to like merge it or something. I don't know, so whatever. And so they'll create a fix for their problem into that code that then may unintentionally affect somebody else, right?
Right.
And you have no idea because you don't know how everybody else is using your code, right? And so that becomes a part of the challenge. And the bigger the project and the more eyes on it, you actually get less and less quality. Because even what you described, when you have a bunch of people, if you send you're just doing a document, right? You're doing a little write-up, a blog post, whatever, and if you pass it to 2 people, 2 people know you're asking them, hey, I need you to review this. They'll probably give it a little bit more attention. But if you actually give it to like everybody, right? The chance that like everybody else is assuming somebody else is doing it.
Yeah.
You often get less quality reviews from the individuals.
So I hear where you're going with this, and I think what's happening in as people are listening, there's probably quite a bit of upsetness happening, because what did we promise people, right? We promised that the whole premise behind these giant open source projects was more eyes on it means it's definitely safer. It's definitely going to have less bugs. But I'm not picking on that. I'm simply saying that's like what you're saying is accurate, right? The more people you have looking at something, the better. And I think the more this just makes sense to me. The more abstracted something is, the less the people that work on that abstracted thing understand how it actually functions down below in the guts, which is why cloud compute has become, for me, such a, I don't know, such a turning point, such a pivotal moment in compute history, in IT history, because we are having to develop technologists at a level that is abstract to understand the new tech, that many don't have any idea why a packet goes from here to here and actually comes back, right? It's kind of like my kids are experts at using the iPad, but when it crashes, they have no idea why. They could not tell you, like, Dad, how does this thing work? I just pushed it. I click and I push and I pinch and I zoom and it works. Like, what do you mean? There's stuff that happens underneath this. That's my concern, is as we, not to get too philosophical, but as we get into times where everything is becoming more abstract from the zeros and ones of it, we're not thinking about registers. I learned a programming language that I actually learned was writing assembly on MIPS RISC. Okay, I get it. That was back when dinosaurs roamed the earth, the early dinosaurs, not the late ones. But I was actually kind of good at it. Like that stuff made sense. You fill a register, you create an operation on it, you put it into stack. Like things happen. Okay, cool. How do you go from there to like some of these really abstract, and whether it's Ruby, whether it's Python, whether it's whatever it calls, like I feel like that connection between the two is missing, right? We do developers. I don't know if you know this, but do developers that go through like their formal schooling, do they learn all that connective tissue, all that down below stuff, or are they just being taught that the here's how you write Python?
Yeah, I don't think they are. And
That's scary.
yeah, and going to the get off my lawn thing, I, I some of it I do think is generational. Like the Gen Xers and millennials, uh, we had to learn a lot of that stuff just to make things work, right? Like,
Right.
we had like, we had to like configure hardware, and like we understood the problems of like of drivers and all this, like at the physical layer, right? On the network side, same thing. Most of us were looking at packet sniffers just to make sure we were even online half the time, right?
Yeah.
Like, right. And so, even something like a burp proxy, where you're actually looking at the HTTP traffic, that most people think, oh, that's the actual raw traffic. No, actually, there's the TCP layer that most people have no idea how that impacts anything. And most of the time you don't have to care, but they don't even know the HTTP, like looking at HTTP traffic, that doesn't make a lot of sense to them. They're familiar with what the framework gives them, right?
Yeah.
And so they're so abstracted from understanding the traffic that's where they're going to miss out on truly understanding what's happening, right? They're not going to understand that all that data is like MIME encoded. Oh, what does that mean? As far as they know, it just came to them as a JSON blob, and so they don't know where you can like hide attacks and things like that. So they don't really understand it. So when they're abstracted from it, you're not aware of what comes before and what's going to come after. And you had mentioned earlier, like the promise was the more people that are looking at it, the better it'll get. And I'll say that's been true from a feature standpoint in particular, not necessarily a security standpoint. Sometimes security has helped. I mean, once in a while you have somebody in there and you have a lot of eyeballs and somebody will spot something like, oh, like this is not good. Let's fix it. Right. And so that'll happen. But I do think from a feature standpoint, the more eyeballs, the more developers has helped. I don't know that it's helped from a security standpoint.
That's kind of where I was thinking too. Is and now we're getting into AI writing code, right? Which is the ultimate great idea, because people copying and pasting from what was that? What's the website? Why can't I think of it right now?
Oh, yeah, now you're
something stack.
Yeah.
Anyway,
I mean, you Google and you Google something, you'll
you Google it, and there's an example, copy paste, whether that has a correct. I mean, as long as it functions, it's great, and there off we go. And now AI is gonna, these generative AI bots are gonna take all that broken code, all that highly vulnerable crap, and good grief, create more out of it. That sounds fantastic. I can't wait. It's going to be a great brave new world, I suspect, huh?
Yeah, I actually get a kick. I see these on like, on Twitter, on Instagram, on YouTube shorts, like people saying like software developers are going to be extinct in 5 years or whatever because the AI is going to write all the code. And like, you know what you're talking about. Like,
yeah,
there will be some things, right? But you still need real developers to build the building, the building bricks of everything else, right? So you're going to need developers. For many years there's a tech high school near me, and there's a Cyber Patriots program. I'm familiar with those guys, right? The Cyber Patriots is like a ROTC spin-off, right, or whatever. It's part of the ROTC programs for high schools. And I would get in I'd bring in some of these high school students as interns over the summer, and I usually would have them like go build something, like build me a shopping cart application, right? And this was like kind of my normal. I had like kind of built this model to do it, and so they would build it. I would ask for this feature, that feature, right? Like, okay, I want to be able to see the list of products. I want to see one product. I want to be able to review a product. I want the whole checkout process, right? I'd go through that. Inevitably, they would have SQL injection vulns, all these things, right? And cross-site scripting on the review page, right? And I would just walk them through like how they make, what their mistake is, and show them how to fix it, right? And how to like write code and how to like start to not trust user input and kind of build that fundamentally into them.
Yeah.
And so as I was doing the Dan on Dev series, I was like, I wonder if I could do that, but use AI. And sure enough, I used ChatGPT and I asked it to write I basically gave it the same prompt I'd give these students. And it came up with the exactly like, it was like almost line for line, the same code I was getting from the students, right? I looked at a couple of my students. I'm like, this is exactly the same. It gave me the exact same vulnerable code that the students gave me.
Oh no.
So I'm probably still going to do that series and like actually show ChatGPT giving a totally, answering the prompts, giving the code, writing the product, and how vulnerable that code is. Because all the sample code out there is vulnerable by and large.
Yeah. Yeah, that's super interesting. I was just thinking, and I was searching for it. And I can't find it, but I had this draft sitting in a blog post I've been meaning to write, which I've completely neglected over the last couple of years. I don't know if you guys know, I was supposed to be a fairly prolific writer, and I just kind of quit because life got busy. But this whole notion that the like development used to be something that was reserved for the select few, right? Select few people could write code because boy, it was very sparsely understood. It's kind of an elitist thing, and like, oh, if you can't, it's kind of like when you and I, Dan, were probably early teens, late teens, mid teens, somewhere in the teens, where like, hey, your Slackware Linux came on floppy disks, and you had to compile your own kernel and make everything work. Like, if you couldn't do that, you weren't accepted into the community, into the group, because you didn't know what you're doing. And then we've democratized it, made it pretty much like it. I'm not saying anybody can be a good developer, but just about anybody can write code now. While that's awesome, again, spurs innovation and opportunity and all sorts of wonderful things. However, now we have sort of the wild west, and whether you're downloading an app to your phone that you don't know where and how it was written, most people don't. Most people don't even understand how the apps on their phones work. And I'm not talking about like general population. I'm talking about IT people that don't really understand like the mechanisms underneath how Android works. I had a really odd conversation recently with somebody that said, well, I have to keep closing all my Android apps. Otherwise, otherwise my phone will run out of memory. Like, he's like, it doesn't automatically, like, why can't you just, where's the X to close the app? I'm like, that's not how Android works. Like, it puts things, like, you don't know this, like, you're like a power user. And so we had this really very strange conversation, which just prompted me to think that, like, wow, many of us that sit at our laptops, launch AWS instances, put out apps for people, like, we really don't understand the underlying mechanisms of how a packet or a byte goes from here to here, why your screen lights up in a particular way, right? How the how Wi-Fi works, the mechanisms underneath it. And while that's great, like, we don't like, not everybody has to be a genius to use IT and build and innovate and develop. There is a lot of risk that adds in, and it becomes incumbent upon those that are designing these frameworks to make sure that they're resilient against the casual developer. And I hope we're doing that. Are we doing that, Dan?
I think so. I think I see a lot of improvement. I mean, even if you step back and you look at like the raw traffic, right? HTTPS.
Yeah.
That has had a massive impact. that is now just a default, right? Like the industry has said, this is now how we do things, right? Like everything's going to go over HTTPS. If it doesn't, you're going to be getting a warning, right? Essentially. And like I used to go into the mobile, I used to go to the mall and pop up a hotspot as ATT Wi-Fi and just sit in the middle of the mall and have, and I'd be sitting there with like watching traffic on Burp, and so I had my like what's that device? Not the rubber ducky, the same company.
Pineapple.
Anyway, huh?
The pineapple.
The pineapple. Yeah, I'd have my pineapple up. I'd be monitoring monitoring all the traffic, and then people's devices would be connecting. It's in their purse, in their pocket. It would be connecting to me, and then as soon as it hit, an internet connection, all the apps that had background checks would spin up and start looking up. So many apps were HTTP. And then a lot of them was that did default to HTTPS did not require a valid cert. They had like the developer mode on, and so I could still see the traffic, right, as long as I had a cert on there. And so I did a whole series, I did a whole bunch of conference talks for a few years around some of that, and I was like hacking fantasy football. Like my friends would come on, I would host the draft day, and I would record everybody's session token while they were here. And then throughout the season, the session token never changed. And I could actually, change their lineup, mid-season. And I would like,
nice.
I'd like text like, hey, aren't you going to play a quarterback today? I know you're trying to go easy on me, but they're like, what? Trying to like get their quarterback in the lineup. But that has become much more difficult. I've tried to do it more recently, and the lockdowns with HTTPS are a lot more rigorous. They're, like that stuff, those defaults, and even session tokens on mobile apps cycle more frequently. So there are these improvements that we're seeing. Are they enough? I'm not sure. I don't think so. But I do see, like, if I take the length of time that I've been watching this, from it being super easy. I mean, even cable back in the like late 90s, you were on the same LAN as your neighbors, right? Like I remember like looking at all my neighbors, computers.
Printers.
Yeah, their printers, their computers. I remember like what was that the CDC app where you could you could actually install it on like Windows 95 machines back then, and then get full remote desktop control, like stick like a VNC client on them or whatever. And that stuff is way harder because a lot of the base has improved. So I do see that, like when I look over the stretch of time, I see these incremental improvements. But I see we've also introduced a whole bunch of new problems, right? And so it's a mixed bag.
I hate mixed bags. I just want things to get better. I do. I just want things to get better. But I quoted this earlier, and then this is a Jeremiah Grossman thing. Like we had this conversation probably 10 years ago, and I bet if we had it today, it'd probably be the same answer. It was, are things getting better? And the answer was yes. However, and you guys are going to get sick of me saying this. However, the rate at which they're adding to the bad pile is faster. So yes, we're solving problems. We are. And we're fixing framework issues, and we're making frameworks safer, and dependency checkers, and listers of SBOMs and stuff like that. But that moves slowly. Innovation that outpaces that, I would say 3-1, right? And we've got to find a way. I can't believe I'm saying this. It's halfway through 2023, kids. We've got to find a way to get into the actual stream of innovation so that when something new hits that's meant to make things easier, faster, better, also safer, right? It doesn't have to be perfect, because perfection is the enemy, because we'll never get there. But I'd like some mechanisms that are regularly attended to, reviewed, and it doesn't have to be an elite few sitting in an ivory tower, but we can't leave security at a code framework level to everybody, including me, that can contribute to this thing. Like, that's probably not a good idea. And so somewhere leaning towards the more, centralized knowledge part, I think is where it probably will succeed best. But every time I turn around, there's a new language that's being talked about.
Well,
And
and
I,
that,
yeah,
yeah, I mean, interrupt for a second. I think that's exactly where it's exciting. Like, I think if security folks are really paying attention to how developers are building, right? Like the way people build now, I think JavaScript and Node took a lot of security people off guard because they weren't paying
yeah,
attention. Like, oh, that's like the little web guys, the web client side code, whatever. And I was guilty of that to some degree myself. But I've always been interested in, like, how are people building now? How is that evolution happening? And most of the time, security is like way behind chasing, like looking, going like, oh wait, you just like, we're sitting here trying to like build up this path. It's kind of like when you have kids, right? You're like trying to clean the room that you just messed up, and then you look up and they're like made a whole new disaster, right? Now they've
yeah. There's
got
three rooms
crayons on the
ahead. There's
wall,
three
right?
rooms ahead of you. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
And
Uh-huh.
I think that's how security has been with the development. And hopefully we can learn from that and start kind of getting on the bleeding edge with some of these developers and watching what they're doing. This AI stuff, AI code, we need to be from the security community. We need to be watching that, not kind of derisively, like, I was kind of joking about earlier, but I'm also paying attention. Like, we need to be paying attention, see how that's going, on the edge, watching them, spotting the challenges with it, and maybe making improvements early and not waiting till it's like, 5 years from now and they're like, oh, we don't need developers anymore, we're just going to use AI. And then we're like, oh, but that's a problem. Like, we need to be saying that's a problem right now, and figuring out how to improve it, not waiting for that mess, right? Let's not be 3 rooms behind the kids making the mess.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a great. So, all right, let's end it on some optimism. We're out of time, but I do want to end it on some sort of optimism, perhaps. I think I'll let you go second so you can think about it. I think for me, my point of optimism is that we have come a long way from printf, uh, and printf as printf, right? We've come a long way from back when I was giving talks on the fact that people wrote, if then statements inside SWF files to do authentication, right? So we figured some things out. The fact that the entire world's application infrastructure seems to be running on a protocol, HTTP, HTTPS, right? And the HTML, loosely speaking, that really was never designed for this, is still bugging me, and we keep adding on top of it. But I guess the point of optimism here is that it hasn't broken. Like, as bad as everything is, it hasn't just fallen over and just completely catastrophically collapsed. So I guess that's a testament to its own resilience. So I guess that gives me hope for the fact that things are only as broken as we're allowing them to be. Right? Is any more and things would fall over, any less and we'd be putting too much effort into too little results. I think that's I'd like to think that that's optimistic. Maybe.
Yeah. Well, and I'll say some of those standards are important to, like, let's be in the mix of those standards early, right? I mean, I'm sure. I mean, although some of it's you can't imagine, right? When they were creating HTTP, right, in the standard, couldn't imagine what people would eventually want to stick on top of it, right? I mean, it was, it was designed as like a cart, right? And now we've got we got like houses and buildings on top of it getting shuttled across, right? It was like, no, we were supposed to just pull hay, right? Like, this is a wooden cart with wooden wheels, and now we're using it for the infrastructure of the world. But it's managed. It's been kind of surprising. No, I think, again, we need to be paying attention, I guess, as new standards are coming. as this AI revolution is coming, we need to be paying attention so that we can get into the conversation earlier, hopefully resolve some things earlier instead of playing catch up, right? And we've done a little too much catch up. There's always going to be some of that because you don't know, like you can invest a whole bunch of energy down a trail and developers will like, oh, this is super exciting. Now it's out of trend and now they're moved on, and you don't want to waste too much time either. But still, you got to be paying attention. And so that's where I think us on the AppSec side of things, as opposed to like network security, like the other security folks, right? On the AppSec side, it's an exciting time. There's so much to be watching and so many answers to still give and be part of that. I think it's fun. I'm enjoying the space.
I loosely keep tabs on it because it's not something I'm currently working, but it's obviously something I spent a great deal of my time and energy in. But I will say, get off my lawn. This is still let the adults handle it sometimes. All right, Dan, this has been fun, man. This is a kind of cool 2-parter where we just got to sit down and chat. I think we haven't done this in a long time. It's been a while. It's been a long time since I got to sit down. But hey, are you coming out to Black Hat?
Yeah, I will be. So we'll have to connect.
Make sure you catch RAFCon.
Okay.
So, all right, folks, that was Dan on Dev. Great podcast. Highly recommend you go check out the video. It's on. He's got it on LinkedIn. Also retweeted on Twitter. I think we'll probably find a way to put it on Threads. I don't know. You guys on Threads? Where are the cool kids hanging out these days? Anyway, thanks for listening. This has been another edition of the Down the Security Rabbit Hole podcast for the 560th episode. I'm going to sign off and we'll catch